The year was 1971. It was 3 years after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. A year after the first gay pride marches in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And the same year that the Equal Rights Amendment was reintroduced in Congress for debate since 1921. In California, Governor Reagan saw legal aid programs as a direct threat to the economic interest of his political base, and he was actively seeking to defund them. So it was in this context that Public Advocates founders envisioned a different type of law firm, one that could be responsive to the immediate needs of the community, but not have its funding held hostage by politicians like what was happening with legal aid.
Public Advocates may have been born in San Francisco, but it was actually conceived in a Chinese restaurant in Berkeley. Bob Gnezda and Tony Klein and I were all Yale alumni, and we each headed up a different government-funded legal service program. I was the first director of litigation of San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Assistance Foundation. Bob was the director of litigation of California Rural Legal Assistance, and Tony was the head of the National Housing Law Project. And our problem was that all of our programs were constantly under attack from the government.
The Republican Party, and Ronald Reagan in particular, and those around him, thought that the idea of the government paying lawyers to represent people to sue the government didn't make sense.
And our strategy sessions in the Chinese restaurant gradually turned to the idea of forming our own nonprofit public interest law firm that would not be dependent on government funds and therefore not be so vulnerable.
It was to accomplish what the legal system had failed to achieve so far, which was to integrate law with social purposes.
I personally wanted us to be named the Golden State Warriors, but that didn't fly.
And that's how Public Advocates was born. They leased an office on Turk Street in San Francisco, and they opened the doors to the first public interest law firm west of the Mississippi River.
One of those first and most important cases that I think I worked on at Public Advocates was the South of Market urban renewal case.
One day, a group of elderly men walked into our law firm, and they asked us if we could provide assistance. They were living in single-room housing in the South of Market area, which was being bought up by the redevelopment agency, and they were being forced out. James Baldwin famously described urban renewal as Negro removal, which is what it was.
The case went on for several years and resulted in several thousand units of low-cost housing for the elderly people that had lived in South of Market.
At the time, in the early 1970s, there weren't that many legal organizations that could do that kind of work. So Public Advocates became a kind of place where all sorts of public interest litigation could happen, from consumers' rights to women's rights to education rights.
My first introduction to Public Advocates was shortly after I moved to Oakland, California, after living in East Africa. I went by the offices of Public Advocates on Turk Street, really funky brick walls in the middle of what was really a homeless neighborhood in San Francisco. I sat there and I thought, I don't know where this is or what these people do, but this is the coolest place I've been. Just period.
Public Advocates was just such an energized place in the middle of an energized city and community of public interest lawyers, and it was a thrill to be there.
They were working on a case, Officers for Justice. It was about to go to trial, and they needed somebody to put together the trial notebook. While I waited for my real job to open up, I thought I'd do that. Stayed for 10 years. The Officers for Justice case, which was truly important and groundbreaking, was the first to end in a consent decree, hiring 20% women, 50% people of color.
It was an opportunist time. Many cases live with us today, which has served the entire civil rights and public interest community exceedingly well.
I was involved in filing the Larry P. case. It challenged the use of IQ tests, putting African American children out of the mainstream and into special classes called mentally retarded classes.
Because of the overuse and reliance of different instruments, testing instruments and evaluation instruments that were not fair and not reflective of the child's capacity, but were basically biased instruments.
We brought a statewide class action that ultimately succeeded in eliminating the disparity, which would have amounted with both generations of 100,000 children out of those classes and back into the mainstream with training.
I would say Public Advocates probably continues to reinvent what public interest law can be. And I know that it has leaned into the racial equity reckoning in a way that is authentic and stretching.
Public Advocates had a diversity of issues. That was always one of its great strengths. The agility and choices that the firm was able to make on behalf of its clients allowed us to move on multiple fronts at the same time.
One of the cases that was so important to me, and I think about it today because of the times we're in, is Yvette Doe versus Belshé. Governor Wilson was seeking to eliminate prenatal care for undocumented immigrant women. So this was a huge issue for the community health centers. The clinics were really in fear, but there were two clinics that came forward as named plaintiffs, La Clínica de la Raza and Tiburcio Vázquez Health Center. I think very brave to come forward as named plaintiffs in that litigation.
We ended up saving prenatal care for, I estimate, about 40,000 women and their children. That really was one of the most probably moving or impactful pieces of litigation that I did.
A movement isn't made from a single court case, winning a lawsuit. It doesn't really end there. You really do have to think about the implementation and what's going to happen. Like, how is that going to actually result in changing the lived experiences of people? And that comes down to people on the ground being engaged and the importance of organizing.
We call this a virtuous circle, and it begins by building authentic relationships with grassroots organizations. And then together we work on identifying what the problems are, what their priorities are. So if we're successful in winning, we can then work to implement it and see it all the way through. An example of the virtuous circle that comes to mind is our work in education. Now, we've been at it for decades, starting with Serrano versus Prieston in the early 70s.
The Serrano case, which ultimately went to the California Supreme Court and won, held that it was a denial of equal protection to use the school financing system and the tax base of each individual school district, because that allowed places like Beverly Hills to have a far better educational system than, say, Baldwin Park, which was just a few miles away, just because they had a higher tax base.
Williams versus California was one of the lawsuits that we brought several decades after Serrano to try to improve the learning conditions in schools by focusing on the adequacy of textbooks and materials, the adequacy of teachers and their training, and then the facilities, many of which were in disrepair.
Now, when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking that, there weren't enough AP classes or French horn wasn't taught to the school's orchestra. These were basic things. This was heat in the classrooms, textbooks, desks even. And California was failing its poorer citizens.
And I remember watching on the evening news young lawyers talking about the Williams case. And I had thought about what it meant for me growing up in Fillmore, here right in San Francisco, and being used to substandard schools. And Williams talked about this idea of communities actually having dominion and power over, in this case, public facilities, our schools.
We were successful in winning over $1 billion to get reinvested into schools.
Arnold Schwarzenegger appeared at the press conference and he publicly said he was embarrassed that such a case in this day and age had to be brought.
The next major school funding case we brought was Campaign for Quality Education in California in 2010. To bring that case, we spent years working with community groups, and it really was a grassroots-based lawsuit. And ultimately, the lawsuit was dismissed, and many of those claims made in that lawsuit made their way into the local control funding formula in 2013, where the neediest kids get more to meet their needs, and districts are held accountable for increasing and improving services for those neediest kids.
When we passed the local control funding formula, there were, the State Board of Education and those agencies in Sacramento. Those were places that were completely dominated by really smart bureaucrats, but not necessarily used to having students and families there talking about their experience and demanding to be heard in those rooms.
Public advocates were not just interested in winning the short-term policy victories. Those are very important because they do have an immediate impact on the material conditions of a community. But what we're striving for in the end is to build the strength, the voice, and the influence of these communities so that we can win more transformative change over time.
In early 2011, Facebook decided that they were going to move their headquarters to Menlo Park and build a massive campus for almost 10,000 workers.
And the community was really concerned because it's one of the only remaining communities of color left in Silicon Valley. And there were no precautions or engagement with the community around community needs.
And I think it was a threat in terms of bringing huge numbers of highly paid workers to the area who could very easily push out the mostly Black and Latino residents of East Palo Alto.
We wanted to make sure that they understood the impact they were going to create on the people as they moved in. And sometimes when you're in a place of privilege, you don't get to see that view and understand that very well.
We worked with the Envision, Transform, Build East Palo Alto Coalition to organize around this, bring legal strategies, both against Facebook and the city of Menlo Park, that got, in that round, some commitments from Facebook, but major commitments from the city of Menlo Park to open their doors for affordable housing in a way that they had not for decades.
Public advocates, they made sure that our negotiations were on point, that we were able to get everything that we were asking for, and that it was being addressed.
It's rare to find a legal organization and a group of attorneys that understand the value of community and the community voices and collective power.
Public Advocates has been following the money for a long, long time. And not just following it, but actually advocating and winning big investments in public education, in public transit, in affordable housing, and in climate investments. A particular area of work was focusing on billions of dollars in cap and trade auction revenues in California. And we said, you know what, the way we're gonna know if $1 of that cap and trade money is actually benefiting residents in a low-income community, a disadvantaged community, as the statute puts it, is by asking, is the money addressing a priority that the community identified? We were able to then advocate over a period of a couple of years to get that embedded in the California state regulations that govern how this money is spent.
We've learned that to affect change, you have to be able to use multiple tools and multiple strategies. But a fundamental component is essentially a power building strategy. How do you actually build power with impacted residents to win what you need to win?
I think that there's some real tension about how do you make progressive change, right? Because there's people who think, well, you get cozy with the people who have power and you bring them your ideas, and then from the top down, change happens. That's not our model at Public Advocates. We're in those rooms when we need to be in those rooms, but we're in those rooms with the people from the community.
When people are able to engage in the process and see the impact that they can have, then they continue to come back and engage and bring more people with them. And that's when we are able to shift the dynamics of power.
When COVID hit and the first shutdown orders were coming in March of 2020, we were ready. Public advocates worked with our core partners in Housing Now, core base building groups with tenant members all over the state to articulate demands from renters early on, demanding no rent increases or evictions during the pandemic, demanding rent relief, demanding relief from mortgages, demanding an end to homeless sweeps.
And we saw so clearly, maybe for the first time, what a critical space a school is, not just as a place of learning, but also a place of support and a community resource hub. And so we were well positioned with the network of grassroots partners that we had to do a needs assessment with the California Partnership for the Future of Learning. And so we spoke to more than 600 students and families to find out what was top of mind for them and what they were going through in the pandemic. I think two things really stand out. One was the real need to prioritize mental health in schools. And then number two, that students and families are integral to any decisions that are going to be made and any learning that's going to happen.
The quality of our democracy, it seems to me, is diminishing, and it's frightening. We're living at a frightening time. And I don't think it's too ambitious for a public interest law firm, a modest, small law firm, which has had an inordinate influence during its 50 years of existence, to start thinking maybe in a different way, that what is at stake is that the tools now exist for powerful players to manipulate people in ways that are inimical to the democratic ideals of our system of government.
We think about the kind of communities that we're trying to create externally. It's really important to also judge an organization by the values that it promotes and how it lives inside. And I'm so proud of public advocates because there's intention, and there's love, and there's joy, and there's community. A lot of institutions can learn from that intentionality. And why it's important is we have to live our values, both individually and institutionally, and public advocates does that. Happy anniversary, public advocates.